The first days of internment brought an atmosphere thick with uncertainty, wariness, and silent observations as hundreds of defeated Japanese soldiers passed through the chain-link fences of the Allied detention facility. Most stumbled in wearing threadbare military garments, their fabric hardened with accumulated sweat, mud, and the residue of countless battles fought and lost. The exhausting treks, the perpetual grit of tropical paths, and the merciless island sun had drained their bodies to near collapse, yet nothing could have readied them for the peculiar experiences that lay ahead. Following initial processing, health examinations, and allocation of essential provisions, they found themselves guided toward a sprawling concrete structure fitted with an elaborate network of plumbing overhead. The sight caused many to halt mid-step. This building resembled nothing they had encountered throughout their campaigns in the Pacific Theater. Multiple rows of chrome fixtures emerged from interconnected pipes, each positioned above its own drainage grate. The Allied personnel, moving with practiced efficiency, signaled for the men to remove their clothing and form orderly lines. Gradually, it dawned on them that they weren't merely being detained. They were being required to bathe. Throughout the gathered men, bewilderment rippled outward like waves on water. For Japanese military personnel during wartime, washing had been an infrequent luxury, often improvised in streams or ocean shallows, perpetually limited by scarcity of supplies. A simple bar of soap had become something precious, nearly mythical. Yet now, held by those they'd been trained to view as mortal adversaries, they faced an elaborate and systematic cleansing procedure. Some gripped their meager possessions suspiciously, anticipating deception. Others exchanged hushed concerns about the vapor emerging from the plumbing. Their minds recalled propaganda disseminated by commanders before their capitulation, tales of Allied savagery, warnings that imprisonment meant degradation, promises that captured soldiers would face treatment beneath that given to livestock. Now confronting these pristine metallic fixtures, they questioned whether some concealed torment awaited. The personnel, growing frustrated with their reluctance, issued sharp commands in English while repeating their gestures. Footwear, belts, shirts, everything needed removal. Gradually, hesitant fingers worked at fastenings, and bodies bearing the marks of jungle warfare stood bare. The men felt exposed, vulnerable before strangers and fellow soldiers alike. Nevertheless, they complied, accepting the wrapped bars of cleansing agent pressed into their hands. Then arrived the rush of flowing water. From the suspended network erupted torrents of clear, heated liquid. The immediate warmth startled everyone. Momentarily they tensed, anticipating discomfort. But as the streams flowed across their backs and arms, carrying away accumulated layers of filth, an unexpected tranquility settled over them. Some let their eyes close, watching dirt spiral toward the drains. Others applied the coarse cleanser tentatively, as though confirming this was truly permitted. Gradually, their initial apprehension dissolved into subdued wonder. They hadn't experienced such warmth and renewal in countless months, perhaps even longer. Throughout the territories where they'd engaged in combat, water had been strictly controlled, washing facilities completely absent, parasites and illness widespread. To stand beneath a continuous flow of heated water without containers, without bellowing superiors, without limitations, represented an almost incomprehensible privilege. Now, under enemy supervision, they achieved greater cleanliness than they'd ever known in their own military quarters. Upon emerging, they discovered stacks of absorbent cloth waiting. Substantial terry fabric arranged in neat piles. Numerous detainees handled them as if examining relics from an unknown civilization. They dried themselves uncertainly, unfamiliar with such materials. For the Allied forces, this represented standard facility protocol. For the Japanese, it constituted a profound discovery. They emerged with dripping hair, skin flushed from the heat, and an unmistakable current of amazement passed between them. The dread that had seized them upon entering the washing area had transformed into puzzlement. Had their captors genuinely provided relief instead of punishment? That initial experience with the facility's washing stations remained embedded in their consciousness long afterward. It marked the start of numerous revelations that contradicted everything they'd been conditioned to believe about their adversaries. The encounter involved more than removing accumulated grime. It meant confronting the gap between their indoctrination and their current reality. The contemporary washing facility with its unlimited heated water and cleansing supplies evolved into something symbolic, the understanding that imprisonment might not bring humiliation, but rather an unanticipated introduction to another society's practices. After those first ablutions concluded and the detainees returned to their quarters, a profound quietness settled throughout the space. They positioned themselves on simple benches, some holding their neatly folded garments, others still drying their hair with the substantial towels, remaining uncertain whether they'd received kindness or encountered some concealed danger. Most kept their gazes lowered, as if verbal acknowledgement might violate some implicit regulation. Internally, though, discomfort churned within them. They'd received repeated warnings that Allied capture meant shame, suffering, and execution. Through secretive instructions before engagements, Japanese commanders had described nightmarish enemy facilities where hunger and brutality were certainties. However, the first requirement imposed on them involved washing with cleanser and heated water. For most, it appeared dubious, excessively generous, overly sophisticated. A former maritime engineer from coastal Japan remembered how Allied information leaflets had shown cheerful detained soldiers receiving nourishment and comfort. He'd consistently rejected those materials as propaganda meant to undermine Japanese resolve. Now, experiencing genuine cleanliness after endless months, he recalled those depictions with uneasiness. Might some portion of them have been accurate? Yet another consideration emerged, more sinister and frightening. Perhaps these washing areas served purposes beyond sanitation? Speculation spread rapidly, particularly among those with clearer recollections of wartime messaging. Several discussed execution chambers in hushed voices, making connections to unclear accounts regarding European events. Though details remained scarce, the possibility that Allies might employ washing facilities for concealed brutality circulated quietly. The personnel observed their reluctance. They noticed clusters of detainees hesitating at entrances, their expressions clouded with doubt. Instructions were reiterated and interpreters conveyed in imperfect Japanese that washing constituted required sanitation. However, distrust didn't dissipate readily. For individuals conditioned to view capitulation as worse than dying, any gesture of consideration felt deceptive. They speculated whether the cleanser contained toxins, whether the water's warmth masked something harmful. Several actually avoided thorough washing, simply dampening their limbs before withdrawing. The cultural disconnect intensified this jarring experience. Within Japan, washing held profound cultural significance connected to purification ceremonies in mineral springs and communal bathing facilities. However, combat had eliminated these customs, leaving personnel unwashed for extended periods, infested with parasites, battling persistent ailments. The facility's washing areas, conversely, featured utilitarian construction. Arrays of metal fixtures and drainage systems, functional without intimacy, functioning with mechanical precision. For the Allies, this represented efficient sanitation, nothing beyond that. For the Japanese, it seemed foreign, automated, nearly impersonal. The practice had been stripped of its meaningful elements, converted into something practical yet disturbing. For multiple days, discussions between detainees revolved around identical concerns. What motivated the Allies to expend heated water on prisoners? Why supply cleanser, drying cloths, and time when they could have simply maintained them in squalor? Did this represent authentic kindness, or did it form part of some broader strategy to weaken them psychologically? Hypotheses proliferated within the poorly illuminated quarters. Several proposed that washing served as manipulation, a method to diminish opposition through comfortable treatment. Others suggested that concealed substances might be incorporated into the water. Anxiety persisted, strengthened by recollections of their commander's cautions. However, no retribution materialized. No concealed suffering appeared. The individuals returned to quarters each evening, continuing to breathe, continuing to exist, more sanitary than previously. Progressively, doubt started weakening, giving way to cautious, hesitant interest. The Allies maintained the routine the following day and each subsequent one. Cleanser distribution persisted. Personnel ensured every individual entered the washing area, and still nothing adverse occurred. Mistrust lingered, though now it combined with another sensation, perplexity. What variety of opponent would concern themselves with whether their prisoners maintained cleanliness or harbored fewer parasites? For individuals conditioned to view detention as worse than dying, this recognition proved as disconcerting as the washing itself. The regular pattern of sanitation quickly integrated into facility existence, though initially it seemed imposed on the Japanese detainees. Every dawn or dusk, based on scheduling, personnel arranged them and escorted them to the washing area. At the threshold, they obtained cleanser enclosed in packaging, emanating powerful industrial scents unlike anything familiar, plus drying cloths, frequently bearing military logistics markings. The procedure remained systematic. Undress, position yourself beneath the flows, cleanse completely, dry off, dress again and depart. However, as days evolved into weeks, the detainees started comprehending that this wasn't a brief arrangement. Sanitation constituted a requirement, an order maintained as rigidly as attendance checks and evening restrictions. The Allies communicated sanitation expectations using translators, demonstrating proper cleanser application, demanding that individuals clean not simply their limbs and faces, but their extremities, their scalps, and the concealed areas of their forms. Parasite inspections came next, performed by medical staff who examined garment seams and sleeping materials. Anti-parasite treatments were distributed alongside fresh underclothing. For the initial occasion, numerous Japanese personnel understood that their opponents regarded illness prevention as earnestly as they regarded provisions or armaments. For the Allies, sanitation wasn't an indulgence, but essential for maintaining structure, wellness, and order throughout the facility. For the detainees, this practice brought an unusual combination of embarrassment and intrigue. From one perspective, they'd been deprived of distinctiveness, forced to wash when commanded like children. From another, they found that existence without persistent irritation, lesions, and contaminated injuries proved remarkably bearable. A non-commissioned officer who'd served in island campaigns recalled periods when his group washed merely once in murky waterways, while infected wounds proliferated throughout his unit. Comparatively, following merely several weeks of mandated washing, the lesions covering his limbs started recovering and the persistent respiratory problems troubling him subsided. This represented a subtle, irrefutable advancement, a contradiction that challenged his dignity. Communication difficulties created perpetual misunderstandings initially. Numerous detainees couldn't comprehend when personnel shouted regarding scalp washing or extremity cleaning, therefore they performed minimal efforts. When they attempted avoiding procedures, they were directed back beneath the flows, monitored frustratedly until the cleanser produced adequate suds. Several harbored resentment toward this oversight, grumbling about its demeaning nature. However, despite their opposition, they couldn't reject the outcomes. Their garments, cleaned consistently through facility methods, no longer bore the repugnant odor of deteriorating fabric. Bedding carried subtle detergent fragrances rather than perspiration and decay. The quarters, previously overwhelming with unwashed human scent, became increasingly bearable, including for those who never acknowledged it vocally. Slowly, the feeling of distrust transformed into routine. Detainees started expecting the procedure, arranging themselves with reduced opposition. They discovered how to clean more completely, to dry with attention, to arrange the cloths as directed. Several actually evaluated cleanser varieties, observing which produced superior lather or contained less aggressive fragrances. Though minor, for individuals deprived of autonomy, these evaluations became discussion topics, methods to occupy extended periods of inactivity. Sanitation had changed from an order into a collective practice, something that subtly connected them as a group. What affected many most profoundly was understanding that their captors anticipated them to preserve self-respect despite detention. Being directed toward washing and supplied with cleanser involved more than illness management. It concerned maintaining particular human standards. Within the Japanese forces, personnel had learned that ease meant fragility, that tolerating squalor and discomfort demonstrated distinction. Currently beneath their opponent's authority, they witnessed that consistent washing could constitute discipline equally as much as bearing weapons. This conflict of principles disturbed them, yet it additionally planted initial traces of grudging admiration for the unusual, persistent structure of their captors. When heated water initially flowed across their frames, numerous Japanese detainees inhaled sharply, several actually retreating as if burned. Heat, constant and regulated, descended from the suspended fixtures unlike anything they'd previously encountered. For individuals familiar with makeshift cleaning in frigid waterways or rapidly collected containers, the feeling seemed nearly extravagant. The vapor ascended rapidly, swirling throughout the atmosphere and mellowing the severe illumination of the institutional space. The cleanser, sharp and unfamiliar, created abundant foam against their flesh, removing accumulated months of contamination. They applied it hesitantly initially, then more energetically, amazed by how the foam adhered and washed clear effortlessly. For several, the experience proved intense. They recalled how throughout extended operations in tropical regions, commanders had instructed them to preserve each precious drop, that sanitation remained secondary to staying alive. On isolated territories, washing remained uncommon. Personnel cleaned themselves using scraps, their flesh continually coated with perspiration, minerals, and grime. The infrequent instances when heated water could be warmed in vessels or containers were regarded as exceptional gifts, distributed between multiple individuals. Here, though, every detainee positioned himself beneath his personal cascade of heat, as if such comfort were limitless. This transcended simple washing. This meant entering an alternate reality. The drying materials supplied subsequently intensified their amazement. Dense and moisture-absorbing, they differed from the sparse fabric personnel had previously utilized in Japanese facilities where individuals frequently shared cloths. Detainees held the materials against their skin, detecting the subtle industrial fragrance of cleaning agents. Their flesh seemed revitalized, openings cleared, the persistent coating of tropical regions ultimately removed. This exceeded bodily comfort. It awakened sentiments they'd extensively repressed. Several remembered household washing from childhood, recollections of maternal figures preparing heated water in basins prior to conflict consuming their existence. Others considered communal facilities, currently remote memories of peacetime life. The facility's washing areas rekindled these feelings, though currently surrounded by detention's unfamiliarity. The Allies approached the process without emotion, distributing cleanser and materials using identical direct effectiveness as food. For them, this represented protocol, illness control, morale administration, structure. However, for the detainees, it developed into a subtle awakening. The contradiction tasted harsh. They'd expected brutality, however, they discovered ease surpassing what they'd experienced, including within their personal military. Several experienced disgrace, thinking such comfort diminished them. Others accepted it quietly, appreciative for an opportunity that permitted their exhausted forms to experience humanity once more. Gradually, the washing areas transformed their regular life rather than clawing at parasites or dismissing infected injuries. They discovered that heated water alleviated discomfort and accelerated recovery. Their scalps, previously oily and tangled, became manageable and simpler to arrange. The perspiration odor that had permeated their garments lessened, substituted by the subtle sharpness of antibacterial cleanser. Including the quarters' atmosphere grew clearer, less oppressive as consistent washing decreased the smells of numerous bodies existing in confinement. Detainees started observing these modifications with wonder, silently recognizing that they maintained superior health compared to during warfare. The contradiction troubled their thoughts. How might the opponent whom they'd been instructed to hate supply them with treatment that their personal military had refused? The washing areas represented more than sanitation. They demonstrated a structure so methodical, so rich in materials that it might provide ease including to prisoners. Positioned beneath the cascades of heated water, they couldn't avoid experiencing both jealousy and discomfort. This highlighted how distinct this realm was from their previous one, and how significantly Japan trailed in supplying such fundamental respect to its personnel. During evenings, when the quarters darkened and the extended lines of detainees rested on their bedding, the discussions frequently returned to evaluations of their previous existence in the imperial forces. The topic wasn't armaments, wasn't engagements, but the unusual revelation of sanitation. Individuals who'd traversed Southeast Asian territories, who'd engaged in island jungles, currently discussed cleanser, drying materials and the surprise of heated water. This wasn't the type of subject personnel had previously thought respectable, yet the difference proved too remarkable to dismiss. Within the Japanese forces, washing had remained an uncommon occurrence performed when conditions permitted. Commanders discussed perseverance, of dismissing physical unease, of accepting contamination as evidence of resilience. Personnel frequently continued weeks without cleaning, their flesh covered with contamination, their garments rigid with crystallized perspiration. Parasites and insects populated garment stitching, infected wounds proliferated, unaddressed. The smell of unclean bodies accompanied each march, each encampment, each evening outdoors. Expressing dissatisfaction regarding this appeared as fragility inappropriate for an authentic soldier. However, within these Allied facilities, sanitation became mandated, as if it constituted a regulation equivalent to order directly. A former detainee, previously a ranking soldier, spoke openly regarding how his group on tropical islands had utilized a single corroded container of water for 30 individuals. They'd washed their skin and extremities, yet genuine washing remained impossible. He evaluated it resentfully against the perpetual cascades of heated water during detention. Another individual complained that during northern campaigns, his unit had experienced tissue damage, not simply from temperature, but from utilizing identical unclean footwear for extended periods. Illness had weakened complete groups more successfully than ammunition. Currently, within Allied custody, all individuals cleaned their extremities regularly, and medical personnel examined for contamination as though they represented important patients. The contradiction proved so acute that it burned. This understanding circulated silently among the facility. Including those maintaining dignity couldn't reject that their conditions were advancing. Skin conditions disappeared. Parasites vanished. Injuries recovered. Digestive systems that had previously cramped from organisms currently stabilized through consistent washing and fresher garments. Detainees started associating these advancements with the practices they'd previously opposed. Initially, they comprehended that sanitation wasn't fragility. It represented power, a defense opposing illness more effective than determined perseverance. The considerations weren't simply bodily but societal. Numerous recalled the profound customs of shared washing in Japan, mineral springs among mountains, timber containers in community residences. Washing had previously constituted existence, connected to kinship and ceremony. Conflict had removed it, diminishing individuals to beings enduring in contamination. Currently during detention, the opponent had restored what their personal military had refused. The contradiction unsettled them. Several discussed it nostalgically, recalling maternal figures warming vessels during dusk. Others became quiet, embarrassed that it wasn't Japan, but Allied forces that had renewed this respect. The personnel couldn't comprehend the extent of this surprise. For them, sanitation remained functional, connected to policies and community wellness. They distributed commands without feeling, never considering that the standard washing areas held such significant importance for the detainees. However, inside the barriers, individuals remained conscious, observing the ceiling, understanding that the complete framework of service existence they'd experienced contained defects. It wasn't power to tolerate contamination. It wasn't distinction to dismiss illness. They started questioning, if Allied forces invested this significantly in prisoner wellness, how substantially more must they invest in their personnel? The consideration proved distressing, however uncontainable. Weeks expanded toward months, and the sanitation practice that previously seemed foreign started creating profound patterns within detention's rhythm. All individuals understood the day's structure, awakening, attendance, nourishment, and at planned periods, the journey toward the washing area. What had previously encountered distrust currently developed into a nearly implicit anticipation. The personnel no more required shouting as forcefully, and the detainees no more moved with comparable hesitation. They proceeded in constant formations, cleanser held within their grasp, drying materials positioned across their frames, as if it had perpetually existed this manner. The change wasn't simply bodily but psychological. The Japanese personnel, deprived of their armaments and their purpose, had recovered something unanticipated, a portion of self-respect. Their garments, cleaned consistently, no more held the odor of deterioration. Their forms, washed and inspected, remained clear of parasites and infected injuries. Including the reflected images in minor pools following precipitation showed improved appearances, faces less hollow, flesh less damaged by injuries. This represented an advancement that none might reject, including if they never spoke it openly. Sanitation started representing beyond endurance. It developed into evidence that they hadn't completely diminished to remnants of individuals. The consequences spread among the quarters. Respiratory problems reduced. The persistent clawing of parasite-infected scalps vanished. Bedding carried subtle cleanser fragrance instead of decay. Personnel observed, occasionally mockingly, that the Japanese detainees appeared more structured than upon initial arrival. Several detainees, uncomfortable with this statement, continued opposing internally, maintaining the conviction that these practices were intended to diminish them. However, the reality remained clear. They experienced increased power. Their injuries recovered more rapidly, their rest intensified, and their vitality, although still restricted by detention, became more consistent. For several, this modification awakened dignity instead of embarrassment. They started arranging their drying materials carefully following use, to maintain their footwear with increased attention, to preserve the quarters organized and structured. This recalled previous customs from their homeland, of the careful ceremonies of Japanese residences. Sanitation, they understood, wasn't capitulation to the opponent. It meant recovering portions of their identity, portions concealed beneath the chaos and disorder of conflict. Including discussions changed. Individuals previously too exhausted for conversation currently exchanged subtle observations regarding the unusualness of experiencing renewal, regarding the contradiction that they maintained superior wellness during detention than throughout combat. Allied medical personnel, functional and practical, maintained documentation of the advancements. Reduced instances of digestive illness, reduced contaminations, reduced fatalities. For the Allies, this demonstrated that the structure succeeded. For the Japanese, it represented an enlightenment. They couldn't avoid observing that their captors approached sanitation as an issue of order and consideration, not an advantage but an expectation. This instruction disturbed them, since it differed so dramatically from their personal service philosophy, where tolerating contamination represented a symbol of distinction. Within this environment, the reverse proved accurate. Sanitation meant structure and structure meant power. Gradually, the distrust that had previously surrounded the washing areas dissolved nearly completely. Individuals no more discussed toxins within the cleanser or concealed brutality inside the water fixtures. Rather, they started expecting the heat, including desiring it. The ceremony developed into something anticipated, an instance of bodily comfort within an existence otherwise deprived of liberty. Several detainees remained beneath the cascades beyond permitted duration, letting their eyes shut and permitting the water to flow across them, as though removing not simply contamination, but recollections of loss. Within the silence of these practices, numerous found that sanitation exceeded a regulation mandated by personnel. It represented a renewal of respect, a method to experience humanity once more, including inside the barriers. It represented a delicate, irrefutable change, one that modified not simply their forms, but their complete understanding of what it signified to persist. When seasonal winds moved through the facility, and the daylight shortened, the discussions between the detainees had changed. No more hushed arguments regarding concealed toxins or hidden brutality. The conversation currently focused on an alternate type of wonder. The understanding that these regular ceremonies of cleanser, heated water, and drying materials weren't coincidences of detention, but representations of something greater. Within the poorly lit quarters where individuals positioned themselves on their sleeping areas, they started sharing accounts of their initial experiences with the washing areas, chuckling uncertainly at their personal anxiety and wondering at how standard it had completely developed. A detainee, previously a strict ground forces commander, admitted that upon initially entering the vapor-filled room, he believed it represented a scheme intended to eliminate them. The rest smiled at the recollection, moving their heads, although numerous confessed they'd experienced comparable discomfort. Another individual, more youthful and more communicative, evaluated the facility's washing areas to the major communal washing establishments in metropolitan Japan he'd attended as a youth. The evaluation awakened sounds of longing. The detainees briefly relocated to a realm of ceramic surfaces and timber vessels, to dusks when relatives and communities distributed heat collectively. The contradiction affected them completely. It remained within opponent custody that portions of these recollections resurfaced. What troubled them primarily wasn't the washing areas directly, but what they disclosed regarding Allied forces. If this nation possessed adequate materials to sustain perpetual heated water for its detainees, what must it supply for its personal personnel? If cleanser and drying materials were allocated here so abundantly, what comforts must exist at installations domestically? The difference with their personal background troubled them. They recalled colleagues who perished from contamination since there existed no sanitary water to clean injuries. Personnel who traveled with parasites consuming their scalps. Individuals who deteriorated not simply from starvation but from the gradual damage of their forms through contamination and illness. To understand that the opponent emphasized sanitation so significantly caused numerous detainees to silently confess, although never excessively vocally, that possibly this represented one of the mysteries of Allied power. Discussions became increasingly transparent near the nourishment areas while consuming allocations of grain, root vegetables, or legumes. Several discussed freely their surprise. They confessed that prior to detention they'd conceived Allied forces as savage creatures. Rather, they found them to be structured, systematic, including in something as ordinary as washing. Others extended it additionally, proposing that this indicated a complete society constructed on plenty and effectiveness, one that possessed the comfort to provide such methods including to its opponents. These concepts generated arguments, for not every detainee desired to confess such distressing realities. Dignity continued existing, and numerous reacted at the implication that Allied forces were greater. However, the proof of their personal sanitary flesh, their recovered injuries, their enhanced wellness remained irrefutable. For several, the understanding became harsh. They complained that this ease was intended to diminish them, to remove them of the perseverance that previously characterized Japanese personnel. Others, though, experienced something distinct, a hesitant admiration. They started perceiving the washing areas not simply as sanitation, but as an opening into the extensive materials, the manufacturing strength, and the distinct ideology of their captors. In quiet voices, A minority including confessed that the background had modified how they conceived the realm outside the barriers. Therefore the washing areas, previously dreaded as devices of brutality, developed into locations of understanding. They remain no more simply regarding cleanser and water. They concern the dramatic difference among two realms and the understanding that their opponent's strength depended not simply on armaments, but on structures of existence so sophisticated that including detainees were incorporated into their order. Periods following, when numerous of the Japanese detainees came back to their nation following the conflict's conclusion, the recollection of detention stayed complicated, characterized by disgrace, comfort, and perplexity. However, between the innumerable memories etched within their consciousness, one picture continued with remarkable precision: the washing areas. Individuals who'd engaged on remote territories, who'd witnessed colleagues perish in tropical attacks and maritime attacks, recalled primarily the feeling of heated water descending from fixtures, the cleanser creating foam within their grasp, the mandated pattern of sanitation that had initially troubled and subsequently changed them. Several previous detainees discussed it with their relatives, uncertainly explaining how the Allied forces had demanded regular sanitation. Their partners and maternal figures attended in shock. How might an opponent supply such treatment? Others stayed quiet, hesitant to confess that detention had provided ease superior to what their personal military had allowed. However, privately, numerous recognized that the sanitation expectations of the facilities had modified their understanding of existence. The recollection of perpetual heated water remained as evidence of a society distinct from their personal contemporary, plentiful, and structured in methods that Japan, regardless of its order and custom, couldn't equal throughout the conflict periods. The memory wasn't emotional. For the detainees, washing areas had remained unusual, embarrassing, including terrifying initially, yet duration transformed these emotions. As illness decreased, as injuries recovered, as parasites disappeared, the connection became more powerful. Sanitation represented power. They understood that wellness wasn't an indulgence but a defense, one that Allied forces employed quietly however successfully. Within discussions following return, several confessed that this instruction represented possibly the most significant they brought domestically, not regarding service strategies, but regarding the strength of contemporary existence expectations. Researchers who subsequently questioned them observed how frequently washing areas emerged within their accounts. Contrary to nourishment or labor duties, which differed between facilities, the practice of sanitation remained almost common. It created an impression more profound than allocations of grain or tobacco. Individuals who'd survived starvation throughout combat might endure limited facility nourishment without shock. Yet to receive cleanser and drying materials, to be escorted toward vapor-filled spaces of heated water, this remained memorable since it remained so completely foreign to their conflict background. It represented not comfort, but a completely distinct perspective, one where the opponent acknowledged including prisoners as people who must stay sanitary. The extended consequence remained silently. Several previous detainees, after returning to peacetime existence, preserved the practices they'd acquired during detention. They cleaned more consistently, demanding cleanser, including when limited. They instructed their offspring that sanitation represented order, not fragility. For them, the facility's washing areas hadn't remained simple practices. They'd remained understandings, instructions maintained through generations. Looking back, the recollection remained complex. It recalled them of loss, of capitulation, of becoming diminished to prisoners. Yet it additionally recalled them of endurance, of unanticipated respect within the custody of an opponent they'd been instructed to despise. For numerous, it remained the contradiction that characterized their conflict, that within the exact instance of embarrassment, they'd observed a type of advancement they couldn't dismiss. The washing areas weren't merely regarding water and cleanser. They concerned finding that sanitation, structure, and treatment, including during detention, might modify the complete method an individual comprehended his position within the world.